We were settling in to watch the new Marcus video when the Patreon plug began to take hold. The first selling point was early access to feature videos. Then suddenly, footage from an exclusive video began playing on screen. The pitch was relentless. In the moment it felt like it might never end. But then in an instant, everything went dark, and we soon realized it was time for the video to begin. Celebrity is a curious phenomenon. For as long as societies have existed, there have been individuals within them who hold high status, whether that be because an official role they serve comes with power and influence, or they just possess certain talents and attributes that have come to put them in the public eye. It's the sort of people in the latter category that are most likely to come to your mind when you hear the word celebrity. A glamorous individual or couple walking a red carpet as cameras flash, and the masses scream out in the hope they might be acknowledged by these revered figures, if only for a second. While some might argue the amount of attention we give to those who are good-looking and charismatic enough to wind up on a large or small screen is completely disproportionate to the amount of value they really bring to the world, we would argue there's no point in bemoaning that which is never going to change. Maybe in an ideal world, it would be the faces of soup kitchen volunteers we'd see plastered on the covers of all our magazines. But this just isn't in keeping with human nature. It is, of course, the people we see frequently, albeit not in person in this case, that we develop an interest in. The fact that interest for many of us goes beyond what project they're making next and into areas like how large their homes are, what parties they're going to, and who they're dating may not be strictly logical, but it is in keeping with human nature, so there's not much to be gained from trying to fight it. Having said that, over the last 20 years or so, the culture of celebrity watching has maybe started to get a bit out of hand. As mobile technology has improved exponentially, so too has the ability of notable people to put more of themselves out to the world, as well as the ability of paparazzi to hound those with less exhibitionistic tendencies. And it's in this area of entertainment where we begin to get a glimpse of a darker side of celebrity obsession. Any paparazzo knows snapping a photo of a star during a moment of weakness, or better yet, profound existential pain, can be worth just as much as snagging an exclusive shot of an A-list wedding. Because at the same time as we find an escape in fantasizing about people with lives so much better than our own, there's an even deeper satisfaction that comes from the realization that below the surface, the lived experience of some of these same people may be just as crappy as ours. In some ways, maybe even worse. And when it comes to train wrecks and the personal lives of celebrities spiraling out of control, to an extent they become a seemingly endless soap opera for the masses to consume as each episode plays out in the media, there has been no better example in recent years than the short-lived marriage and ever-enduring separation and feud between Johnny Depp and Amber Heard. Though just because the saga has and is now continuing to play out in the media as the warped form of entertainment that has just been described, don't mistake this video's preamble as insinuating the accusations made by Mr. Depp and Miss Heard, or the issues surrounding said accusations, are any laughing matter. And also don't be lulled into some sort of illusion that just because the subject of today's video is a messy celebrity divorce, it will somehow be shallower than some of the more customary criminological subjects explored in other installments from this channel. If only. Truth be told, today's case is one with so many events, claims, witness statements, recordings, and other miscellaneous pieces of evidence, that one of the most challenging parts about making the video has been figuring out where to begin, where to end, and what to include in between. As you likely know, it is a domestic violence case, and in terms of what has played out in court, it is one comprised of 14 incidents. Covering all 14 in enough detail to be fair to both sides would be unrealistic for the format, and covering them all in a manner that is relatively expedient and digestible would result in analysis so superficial it would render itself pointless. So what we have done instead is narrowed it down from 14 to 5 incidents, choosing the ones to keep based on how significant to the case they are overall, the amount of raw evidence and witness accounts there are pertaining to them to limit the amount of he said, she said, and that provide a decent enough spread of information that might cast either side in a negative or positive light, in the hope that doing so will leave you with more or less the same stance you'd have if you went through every piece of information involved with the case cover to cover. Though there are plenty of resources in the description for if you're not so sure of that once all is said and done. Even just the 5 key incidents contain enough details to get very convoluted very quickly. So to try to make things as easy to follow as possible, we're going to run through them twice. The first time we'll tell the story of Depp and Heard's relationship and the 5 chosen incidents leading to its dissolution briefly, and entirely from the perspective of Amber Heard's lengthy witness statement, taking all of her accusations completely at face value. After that, we'll take a look at each incident from more of an investigative perspective, presenting Depp's version of events as well as evidence that both sides have put forward to support their case. And then there will be a final section where we put forward some choice odds and ends in the case. Details that did not fit naturally into our 5 chosen incidents, but that we felt could be seen as egregious to leave on the cutting room floor. As you can probably tell by this point, we have quite a lot to get through, so let's get started. In 2009, filming began for the 2011 feature, The Rum Diary. The film, based on Hunter S. Thompson's novel of the same name, would go on to perform poorly at the box office, receive mixed reviews at best from critics, and ultimately prove to be totally forgettable in every way but one. It facilitated the introduction of one of the century's biggest movie stars, Johnny Depp, to the up-and-coming movie starlet, Amber Heard.
Why did she have to happen? Just when I was doing so good without her.
By 2012, Depp and Heard were an item. The 23-year age gap raised some eyebrows, but love knows no boundaries. And even if it did, most 50-year-old men are not quite as appealing to 27-year-old women as Johnny Depp. In 2015, Depp and Heard married, tying the knot with a small ceremony on Depp's private island in the Bahamas. To the outside world, Johnny Depp and Amber Heard's union was as picturesque as one would expect a Hollywood couples to be. But as we now know, below the surface, the relationship was no fairy tale. By Heard's account, as early as 2013, a pattern had begun, which should sound very familiar to anyone who has been unfortunate enough to fall victim to domestic violence. One of abuse, followed by remorse, then reconciliation and a period of calm before the cycle repeats itself. While most of the time Depp exhibited the gentle, quirky demeanour that the public knew him for and she had fallen in love with, he had also begun losing his lifelong battle with substance abuse, regularly drinking to excess as well as using a wide range of illicit drugs. And often when he was under the influence, a much darker side of him emerged. One that he and Heard would come to call the monster. When the monster took over, Depp would become wickedly mean-spirited, directing verbal and often physical abuse at Heard. In the days that followed, he would apologise and ultimately convince Heard that he was determined to get back on the wagon. But as time went on, the monster only seemed to grow stronger, and the damage it inflicted only more severe. One toxic element that had begun to emerge in the relationship quite early on was an intense jealousy within Johnny Depp. He would develop suspicions that Heard was having an affair with just about any male co-star she was working with, and was remarkably sensitive about the prospect of her being involved in physically intimate scenes for a man who had been a screen actor for 30 years. This jealousy was the primary driver behind the first incident we're covering in detail. On May 24th, Heard told Depp over the phone that she would be filming such a scene with James Franco for a film they were working on called The Adderall Diaries. Depp responded angrily. Later that day, Heard waited for Depp in his private jet that was set to fly from Boston to LA. When he arrived, he was clearly high. During the flight, Depp began to taunt Heard with lewd and humiliating comments, many of them insinuating she was having sex with James Franco. Heard was particularly mortified by Depp's behaviour, as he had multiple of his friends and personnel on the plane, and she was dismayed that he would degrade her so viciously in their company. Depp began challenging Heard to state how much she enjoyed getting off with James Franco on set, and after she refused to answer several times, he slapped her in the face. At a later point on the flight, as Heard got up to walk to another part of the plane while Depp was taunting her, he kicked her in the back hard enough to make her fall to her hands and knees. Later, he took off one of his boots and threw it at her. At one point, he also threw a fork at her. Eventually, he went to the bathroom and passed out, having been drinking heavily throughout the flight, in addition to being under the influence of whatever drugs he had taken before boarding. This was the most extreme incident up until this point, and Heard had initially been resolute in ending the relationship because of it. But after repeated expressions of remorse, as well as promises that he would undergo detox, Johnny Depp and Amber Heard ultimately wound up back together. The second chosen incident is not really a single incident, as it spans the course of several days. Depp and Heard were staying in a private resort on the Gold Coast of Australia. Having gotten married a month earlier, they were having arguments about pre- and post-nuptial agreements. Depp had again fallen off the wagon, if it can be said he had ever truly been on it. At one point, Heard claims he downed 10 MDMA capsules. Depp berated and assaulted Heard multiple times over a 3-day stretch, but the epicenter of this incident is in the second day. Heard went downstairs to find Depp in the games room, having been up all night on ecstasy. Lines of cocaine were on a nearby countertop, and he was drinking from a bottle of Jack Daniels. Heard said something to the effect that his substance abuse was getting seriously out of hand, and soon Depp was flying into another rage. He grabbed her neck and shoved her against a fridge, telling her he could easily crush her neck. She managed to get away from him and out of the room, but he continued to assault her throughout the day and eventually pushed Heard to her limit. Sometime after the assault in the games room, Depp was still drinking booze from the bottle and began taunting Heard, asking if she wanted to take the bottle from him, which prompted her to snatch it from his hand and smash it on the ground. Depp then flew completely off the handle. He began picking up full liquor bottles and hurling them at Heard as she ran from him. He grabbed her by the hair and threw her across a room where she smashed into a ping pong table which collapsed under her. Shortly thereafter, Depp was gripping Heard's neck and repeatedly bashing her head into the fridge, screaming she made him do this. At this point, Heard's bare feet were beginning to get cut up by broken glass on the ground. He stripped her naked, ripping off the nightgown she was wearing, and started grabbing her breasts. At one point, he ripped a mounted phone off the wall and began repeatedly smashing it right next to Heard's face. Though in the midst of the chaos, Heard did not notice at the time. Depp had slammed the phone with such velocity that in the process, he had severed the tip of one of his fingers. A lot more on that in part 2. Depp continued assaulting Heard for some time, and over the course of everything, her hands and arms wound up badly scratched by broken glass. The episode was so severe, Heard genuinely feared that she might die, but finally Depp relented and she was able to retreat to the bedroom. She locked herself in and took sleeping pills to make it through the night. The next day, when she went downstairs, she found that Depp had painted various messages on a lampshade, a sofa, and various mirrors, some of them scrawled in his own blood. Among the messages were the words "Easy Amber" and "Starring Billy Bob," alluding to an affair Depp suspected Heard was having with Billy Bob Thornton. Heard found Depp in an office, still drinking from a nearly empty bottle of Jack Daniels. More verbal abuse followed, but upon learning how badly injured Depp's finger was, Heard was ultimately able to convince Depp to contact his security team, who arrived sometime thereafter and took him to a hospital. But not before Depp began urinating in the house, attempting to write Amber Heard's name on the walls and carpet. Again, Johnny Depp and Amber Heard ultimately reconciled after this incident. On the night of December 15th, Heard was assaulted by Depp in one of their LA penthouses. During the assault, he dragged her around various rooms by her hair and tore several clumps of it out as she struggled to get free. At one point in this incident, Heard decided to make a gesture of defiance. When Depp knocked her to the floor, she stood back up and looked him straight in the eye. This angered him, and he knocked her down again. This pattern repeated itself several times until Depp took a step back and headbutted Heard in the face, causing her nose to bleed. At this point, Heard resolved to leave Depp for good and warned him that if he touched her again, she would call the police. But this did not deter him from continuing to assault her. More slapping, hair pulling, choking, etc. Eventually, Depp was on top of Heard on a bed, pushing her face down into the mattress and pulling out more of her hair. He had his knee on her back, his other foot on the bed frame, and he began punching her in the head. The last thing Heard remembered was the bed frame splintering before she blacked out. When she came to, she heard her friend Raquel Pennington, who lived in another penthouse on the same floor, crying out in shock. Pennington and another friend, Melanie Iglesias, who was also Heard's makeup artist, had let themselves in after not getting an answer at the door. They took pictures of the bed, Heard's facial injuries, and clumps of her hair that were lying on the carpet. Similar to the Australia incident, Depp left behind a note, scrawled on the kitchen counter with a gold Sharpie. It read, "Why be a fraud? All is such bullshit." Again, ultimately, Johnny Depp and Amber Heard remained together. On April 21st, Depp showed up to Heard's birthday party at their LA penthouse 2 hours late and clearly drunk and high. After the attendees left, Heard expressed to Depp that she was disappointed and hurt by the slight, and soon he was in another rage. He threw a magnum bottle of champagne and other bottles and/or glassware at her, which resulted in her being hit by pieces of shattered glass. Eventually, Depp left the penthouse, smashing various pictures and photographs on his way out. The next day, Heard travelled with friends to the Coachella Music Festival. That same morning, one of Depp's housekeepers discovered what they deemed to be human feces in Depp and Heard's marital bed. Depp became convinced that either Heard or one of her friends was responsible, while Heard maintained the excrement would have come from one of her 2 Yorkshire Terriers. More on this in part 2, unfortunately. On the evening of May 21st, Depp and Heard met in their LA penthouse to discuss their relationship and what promise, if any, it had. Depp was drunk and high again. He was still enraged over the feces incident. Fearing things would soon escalate to violence, Heard texted Raquel Pennington to come over. Depp made an accusation that another of Heard's friends, Io Tillett Wright, was responsible for the feces. Heard then called Wright, put him on speakerphone, and asked him to address the accusation, knowing it to be untrue. Given the inherent absurdity of the situation, Wright began laughing, and this pushed Depp over the edge. He snatched the phone from Heard and began screaming down the line at Wright, before throwing the phone and storming upstairs. Heard retrieved the phone and spoke to Wright, who urged her to leave the building. Before long, Depp had returned. He again snatched the phone from Heard, screamed at Wright one more time, then wound his arm up like a baseball pitcher and threw the phone with full force straight at Heard's face. It hit her right in the cheek and eye.
I said, "You hit me." I was crying. I said, "Johnny, you hit me," because then I start hearing things being smashed, and I said to him, "Honey, you hit me in the eye, my eye. And I start crying, and he grabs my head, takes a fistful of my hair and says, I hit your eye, huh? Let me see your eye. Let me see your eye. What if I pull your hair back?" And he yanks my head back, and he's, I don't know, smacking my face or moving my face, or he's like yanking me from side to side with my hair. I don't know if he's trying to grab my face or if he's hitting my face, or I don't know what's happening, but he's yelling at me, he's screaming about let's see how hard I hit you, and I'm screaming at the top of my lungs.
Okay.
Help, please help. I guess I say call 911. I'm screaming for help, not just in case Io is on the phone, which I don't know because the phone is somewhere after hitting my face. I don't know where it ricocheted and bounced off to.
It was around this time that Raquel Pennington arrived on scene. There was a scuffle as Pennington attempted to defend Heard, and then Depp began drinking from a Magnum wine bottle and smashing various objects with it. Depp's security team arrived at this point and were able to convince Depp to leave the premises, though he continued to smash and throw various objects as he left, and spilled wine in the penthouse and outside hallway. Pennington and her husband, Josh Drew, took pictures of the damage that Depp left in his wake, including the injury to Heard's face. It was this incident that proved to be the final straw.
Okay, Amber. An ugly red mark is visible on the face of Johnny Depp's movie star wife Amber Heard as she leaves court with her lawyer Friday. 30-year-old Heard is claiming domestic abuse by Depp.
Johnny brutalized you?
A judge granted her request for a temporary restraining order, calling on Depp to stay 100 yards away.
Are you going to go to the hospital, Amber?
The hearing came as this shocking photo came to light, a nasty bruise clearly visible. The photo was reportedly taken Saturday night. One report claims Depp threw an iPhone at her.
People has learned exclusively that this is not an isolated incident, so while this photo is very shocking and it's news to a lot of people, the source tells us it's just the latest incident like this.
These additional photos were attached to the court documents. They show Amber's nasty bruises, plus an injury to her chin. And these photos from inside Johnny Depp's house show a shattered picture. Shards of glass are on the floor. This photo is a bottle of wine on the floor along with a red stain, presumably from the thrown bottle. Amber Heard broke down in tears as she was driven from the courtroom in an SUV. The shocking photos couldn't come at a worse time for Depp, who is on a promotional tour for his new movie Alice Through the Looking Glass. Now, he has serious issues to deal with.
But for a time, he was able to deal with those serious issues in a manner that did not entail the incineration of his career and public image. Depp and Heard reached a settlement in the process of finalising their divorce, in which Depp paid Heard $7 million, and neither party really admitted to any wrongdoing. They released a joint statement that read, "Our relationship was intensely passionate and at times volatile, but always bound by love. Neither party has made false accusations for financial gain. There was never any intent of physical or emotional harm." Translation: Depp did not admit being an abuser, Heard did not admit being a liar or a gold digger, and both of them were free to move on with their lives. As part of their arrangement, Heard dropped the restraining order, and both parties signed non-disclosure agreements to ensure there would be no further mudslinging in the press. And that's by and large what proceeded to happen over the course of the next year or so, with both Heard and Depp continuing to work as prominent movie stars. Most notably, Heard starring as Mera in the Aquaman film franchise, and Depp as Dark Wizard Gellert Grindelwald in the Harry Potter spin-off Fantastic Beasts franchise. The latter of which was at the root of things becoming openly acrimonious again when on the 27th of April of 2018, executive editor and columnist for British tabloid The Sun, Dan Wooten, penned an article on The Sun's website strongly criticising J.K. Rowling for openly expressing delight over Depp's casting, in light of the Harry Potter author's outspoken support for women's rights, contrasting with Depp's reputation as a, quote, wife-beater. That prompted Depp to sue The Sun's publishing company, News Group newspaper, and Wooten for libel, which led to a 3-week trial in London that commenced in July 2020, with Heard testifying as the defendant's key witness. Depp also took the stand for several days. You probably already know what the outcome was.
It was the backdrop to this summer's legal blockbuster. Today at the High Court, Amber Heard and The Sun newspaper emerged victorious. The actor claimed her bruises were inflicted by ex-husband Johnny Depp. The judge accepted this and the description of Depp as a wife-beater.
Today has probably cost Johnny Depp hundreds of millions of dollars, and he can make all the protestations after the verdict and all the statements he wants, but the words are Johnny Depp, wife-beater. And the consequences of that are, when big family movies are being cast, they're not going to cast Johnny Depp.
Announcing he would appeal, Depp's legal team said the decision is as perverse as it is bewildering. Most troubling is the judge's reliance on the testimony of Amber Heard and corresponding disregard of the mountain of counter-evidence. With very few witnesses to their violent arguments, the judge had to decide who was telling the truth. He came to the conclusion that on the vast majority of occasions, it was Amber Heard. The judge dismissed the idea that Miss Heard was a gold digger and accepted her career had probably been damaged by the revelations.
I traveled here to the UK to testify as a witness to assist the court. After obtaining a restraining order in 2016 and finalizing my divorce, I just wanted to move on with my life. I did not file this lawsuit. And despite its significance, I would have preferred not to be here in court. It has been incredibly painful to relive the breakup of my relationship, to have my motives, my truth questioned, and the most traumatic and intimate details of my life with Johnny shared in court and broadcast to the entire world. I stand by my testimony. And finally, my heartfelt thanks for all of the tremendous and overwhelming outpouring of support that I have received and the many messages from all over the world. You have given me so much strength, and I send it back to you. Thank you.
The judge who presided over the trial, Justice Andrew Nicole, found that on the standard of the balance of probabilities, Johnny Depp was more likely than not to have been guilty of abusing Amber Heard in 12 out of the 14 incidents she alleged, including all 5 of the ones that this video has covered. We'll make reference to his rationale, as well as criticisms of it, as we go back and unpack the actual evidence pertaining to said incidents, starting right now.
I wish you fucking understood what you are and who you are and how you fucked me over and make me feel sick of myself.
The audio you're listening to right now is a recording from March 8th, 2015. Following the incident in Australia wherein the tip of one of Johnny Depp's fingers was severed. It isn't officially confirmed who turned on the recording device that captured the audio, though common sense tells us it was almost certainly Mr. Depp or Miss Heard, even though both parties have denied being responsible. As you may have guessed, the voice you just heard was Depp screaming at Heard, which doesn't do a lot to begin casting him in a more positive light. It's when other voices appear, seemingly unaware they're being recorded, that things start to get interesting, however. There are 2 people audible in the first section we'll play, Dr. David Kipper and Nurse Debbie Lloyd. Kipper is Depp's doctor and has been treating him mainly for addiction issues. He and Nurse Lloyd are on scene in response to the finger situation. It should be noted that the subtitles we're going to put forward are based on the transcriptions of YouTuber Incredibly Average, who is very much in Depp's camp. Some of it we can hear clearly, other parts are much tougher to make out, and there could certainly be room for confirmation bias, so take it with as much of a grain of salt as you see fit.
He's gonna be super loud.
just, so you know,
Dr. Kipper describes he and his team struggle to find the tip of Depp's finger, and a little while later he calls out to Jerry Judge, Depp's head of security, who is also on scene.
Alright, Jerry. My advice, Emma's going to take care of herself. They're going to take care of me. They can't be together now. It's going to send off come back. So, however, Amber, I think she should be in Los Angeles for the support system. And this act runs course. And this is not going to be 1 day, it's going to be 2 days.
How about I feel like somebody needs to fly with her.
Jerry's going to follow.
She won't touch her.
Judge was. Just allegation. I mean, I know, I don't need to validate what you're saying, but...
No, but I'm just wondering if there's another person. That's what I'm saying.
Well, I asked those same questions earlier, and it all looks like that. For that reason. Like, he's not going to be manipulated. He's a strong guy.
The first thing you likely would have noticed at this point is that Dr. Kipper seems to have insinuated that Heard is responsible for Depp's injury. Again, that's if you trust the transcription. The moments he's supposed to allude to that are admittedly difficult to make out. Beyond that though, the general tone in the room seems completely incongruous with Heard's version of events. You'll recall the Australia incident was one of the most severe. If Heard's account is correct, she should currently have fresh glass cuts all over her hands and arms, as well as presumably numerous bruises after assaults that included having her head repeatedly bashed into a fridge and being thrown onto a ping pong table. Nothing in the way Dr. Kipper and Nurse Lloyd are speaking to each other reflect her being in such a state.
He's got this all over. I mean, he's going to get infected, so that we have to start with ours.
How big of a piece of skin are you looking for?
We're looking at this. We're looking at a third of the heavily third. And it's that, I mean, he's going to get cellulitis. Maybe she should have something. I told Danny it's probably Lisa.
Can I give her 50 of careful?
What?
50 of careful?
Yeah.
300 grams?
Well, I'll tell you what's something in that. This is guilt.
She won't take 50. I gave her 25 and 300 and said we reassess in a little bit.
Next we're going to jump to a point where Jerry Judge can be heard speaking on the phone to Christy Dembrowski, Johnny Depp's sister. Judge has some very notable things to say about Heard's injuries that might provide some insight as to why no one seems to be at all concerned about them. Fortunately, he's close enough to the recording device that in this instance, we don't need to trust anyone else's interpretation of what's being said.
Okay, fine. I don't be saying, I'm just, I've seen you on the bed, I've never seen this bad. And when I say he wrecked his face, I mean it's wrecked. There's no problem. There's TV, I think she did it. There's a cup from, it missed, there's been bottles from. She admits to me, she threw a bottle on me. She did it first. She admits to me that, and I said, last second, she says, actually, that's a really beautiful thing to do in my temple. He was shouting out, screaming out. in the car together to trim down and go legal on this to get this whole thing calmed down. You know, I've been hurt this, I've been hurt that, he's done this, I can understand her. And she gets it also that she hit him first. She actually hit him in the face. Good.
So what exactly is Depp's version of what transpired in the hours preceding this recording? According to Depp, all of the tales of copious drinking and drug taking are untrue. He was sober for most of his stay in Australia, but this changed on the 8th. Heard had been relentlessly yelling at and taunting him after she became enraged from learning he wanted her to sign a post-nuptial agreement. Depp made multiple attempts to avoid the argument entirely by hiding from Heard in various bathrooms throughout the residence they were staying at. Apparently he had learned from experience at this point that engaging with Heard when she was in a certain temper would only cause things to escalate further. All of the screaming and insults caused him to break his clean streak and turn to drink, pouring himself a glass of vodka in the downstairs bar and drinking it. When Heard discovered him drinking, she became further enraged, grabbed the bottle of vodka, and threw it at Depp. It narrowly missed his face and smashed into pieces against a wall. Defiant, Depp then retrieved a second, larger, handle bottle of vodka, poured himself another glass, and began drinking that. Heard then grabbed that nearly full handle bottle of vodka and threw that at Depp. This time, her aim was more on point.
My hand was resting on the marble of the bar like that when she threw it from about this distance, and it smashed into the bar, which and this finger, who I now call Little Richard, was the tip of the finger was severed, and all the bone in here was completely shattered. I mean, it looked like Vesuvius.
A big problem with this incident is there are no other witnesses to the event itself. We have some audio of third parties seeming to voice their suspicions of Heard, and the claim that Heard is screaming out things like, "I didn't do it on purpose." But even if that transcription is accurate, we can't say with certainty that she's referencing the severing of Depp's finger, though while it can't be said that Heard has ever been caught on tape unambiguously acknowledging responsibility. There is one recording, separate to the one we just sampled, where it sounds like she might be on the knife's edge of doing so. This is from a phone conversation that took place sometime after the final incident. In it, Depp and Heard are mainly negotiating how amicably they will be able to handle their divorce, and whether or not they will need to take things to court. Depp recorded the call on speakerphone, presumably without Heard's knowledge.
The last time that it got crazy between us, I really did think I was going to lose my life, and I thought you would do it on accident. And I told you that. I said, oh my God, I thought for the first time.
Amber, I lost a finger, man, come on. I had a mineral can of mineral spirits thrown at my nose.
You can please tell people that it was a fair fight and see what the jury and judge think. Tell the world, Johnny. Tell them Johnny Depp. Johnny Depp, man, I'm a victim too of domestic violence, and yes. It's a fair fight. And see how many people believe or side with you.
It doesn't matter if it's a fair fight.
Exactly, because you're bigger and you're stronger. And so when I say that I thought you could kill me, that doesn't mean you counter with you also that you lost your own finger.
Do you believe you're an abuser? Do you believe you abused me physically?
Do I physically believe? Do I believe I physically abused you?
Yes.
Do you know I'm 115, well not anymore, but I was 115 pounds. I'm a 115-pound woman, and I have the capacity to abuse.
That's not the question. That's not the question.
Have I ever been able to knock you off of your feet?
You started.
Off your balance?
You started these things.
You're going to get up on the stand, Johnny, and say she started it? Really? I have never been able to overpower you. That's the difference between me and you.
Why did you try?
And that's the difference that the whole world and the jury and the judge will see is that there is a a very big difference between me and you.
And while we're on the subject of non-denials, if you were wondering about all those strange messages scrawled on mirrors and furniture, Depp acknowledges he was in fact responsible for those, including the ones in his own blood. His explanation is that he was in shock. He denies the part about trying to write Heard's name with his urine on the walls and carpet. In terms of why Justice Andrew Nicole ultimately found it was Heard's account that was more likely to be truthful, much of it came down to text messages Depp sent to various people in the lead up to the incident. One message in particular, sent on March 6th to his assistant Stephen Duters, showed him seeming to express deep bitterness about his career and legacy. This does not in and of itself speak to his being culpable of beating Heard, of course, but it does speak to him being in a foul mood at the time, independent of any arguments he may have been having about post-nuptial agreements. Nicole also found Depp's overall credibility to be damaged by his claim to have been sober for months leading up to pouring that glass of vodka. He had in fact been messaging his assistant Nathan Holmes in the days leading up to the incident, trying to procure quote, happy pills and whitey stuff, which was taken as meaning MDMA and cocaine. He had also had the Australia house stocked up with alcohol. Depp's explanations were that the happy pills referred to legitimate prescription drugs, and the alcohol he stocked the house with was for Heard and any visitors they might have. Justice Nicole simply didn't buy that. Depp's admitted scrawling of the messages certainly didn't help him either, especially the one that read starring Billy Bob and Easy Amber, as the obvious reference to Billy Bob Thornton, Amber Heard's recent co-star in the film London Fields, aligned with Heard's claims of a seething jealousy in Depp. The written word is something that didn't do Depp any favours when it came to the private plane incident either. Johnny Depp's version of what happened on the plane flight from Boston to LA is as follows. It was Amber Heard, and Amber Heard alone, who was guilty of abuse on that flight. She had been berating him continuously, and he had been doing his best to not engage in any sort of confrontation. The allegation that he kicked her in the back is a fabrication that he believes she derived from the following episode on the plane. At one point, Heard got up from her seat and Depp reached out his leg, with the intention of playfully tapping her on the behind as a sort of reconciliatory gesture. He doesn't believe he was actually able to make contact due to the positioning of the seat, but nevertheless, Heard noticed what he was doing and did not find it amusing, to put it mildly. She reacted with such intense anger that she had to be physically restrained by Jerry Judge and Depp's personal assistant Stephen Duters, which brings us to the first factor that makes this one of our chosen incidents. It has witnesses. Jerry Judge unfortunately passed away in 2019, but Stephen Duters was able to write up a sworn witness statement as well as take the stand for Depp. He affirmed Depp's account entirely. The second factor that makes this one of our chosen incidents, however, is that there are some very curious text messages related to it. And no matter what you ultimately believe happened on that plane, it would be very hard to argue the texts do not, at least at face value, seem to fall very much in line with Heard's account. The morning after the incident, Depp sent Heard a text in which he expressed, quote, shame and regret. He does not make any clear allusions to violence. In fact, he states he does not actually know what happened, and speaks of how he fell victim to his illness and needs to get better for both of them. In Depp's witness statement, he claimed to remember the flight vividly, but his text message paints a picture of a man who was heavily under the influence to the point of blackout, just like what Heard described. In fact, contemporaneous messages to Heard from Stephen Duters himself seem more in line with Heard's account than his testimony. The morning after the incident, he sent her a text saying that while Depp could not remember much, after he was taken through what happened, he was very sorry and didn't want to be a fuck-up anymore. A direct quote from Depp according to Duters. Again, we should note, no violence is mentioned, but it certainly doesn't sound like a situation where Depp was the wronged party. Heard responded to Duters saying that she doubted Depp was truly being made aware of the full severity of what he had done. Duters' response here was particularly damning. Quote, when I told him he kicked you, he cried. It was disgusting, and he knows it. The explanation that was offered for all of this by Johnny Depp and Stephen Deuters was that Depp was merely trying to placate Heard and had instructed Deuters to do the same. Justice Nicole did not buy this, especially in light of yet more text messages Depp sent to people he had no reason to placate. In a message to actor Paul Bettany sent on the 30th of May, Depp described himself on the flight as being, quote, an angry aggro engine in a fucking blackout, screaming obscenities and insulting any fuck who gets near. One text Depp offered to counterweigh all of this was a message he sent to his sister on May 27th, in which he expresses frustration toward Heard and insinuates his only wrongdoing on the plane was breaking his sobriety. Perhaps it's evidence that the other professions of serious wrongdoing were just humouring Heard, but unfortunately for Depp, it can just as plausibly be read as self-pity for being put in the dog box, and doesn't go a long way toward explaining the text he sent to Bettany days later. You'll recall Incident 3 was particularly severe. By Heard's account, she had clumps of her hair pulled out, sustained a headbutt to the nose strong enough to make it bleed, was repeatedly slapped, and also punched in the head with enough frequency and force to cause her to black out. This incident took place on the evening of December 15th. Here's something that happened on the evening of December 16th.
You know, I'd be doing like a jump with a back bend, and you can see this like graceful falling, and my hands are like... And my face, though, is like I've got that...
It has been noted by Depp's legal team that during her appearance on The Late Late Show with James Corden, the evening after she claimed she suffered the severe beating, there are absolutely no injuries of any kind visible on her face. No swelling around her nose, darkness or swelling around her eyes, nothing. Her hair also looks about as full as you could ever expect it to be. Beyond her appearance, her movements are also very fluid. Most notably, as you watch her swing her arms around and raise her hands above her head, you can never detect a shadow of a wince like you would often see from someone who sustained injuries that would cause their limbs to feel stiff. Remember, Depp was allegedly on top of Heard on the bed, pushing his knee into her back hard enough that it caused the frame to splinter. We won't go as far as to say that this categorically debunks Heard's claims. There is no objective measure of precisely how stiff she should look, and Hollywood certainly has a lot of very talented makeup artists, which is in fact Heard's explanation for the discrepancy between her story and appearance on James Corden. But the claim that her injuries are obscured by makeup has problems beyond just looking implausible on the surface. A woman named Samantha McMillan, who worked as a stylist for both Depp and Heard at the time, made a sworn statement attesting that throughout the day on the 16th, she was able to see Heard in a good light, at close range, wearing no makeup, and could see clearly that Heard did not have any visible marks, bruises, cuts, or injuries to her face or any other part of her body. A man named Kevin Murphy, who worked as Depp's estate manager at the time of the incident, also had occasion to see Heard up close on the 16th. In his sworn statement, Murphy wrote that when he arrived at the LA penthouse that day, Heard called him into the master bedroom, where he found her sitting at the edge of the bed crying. She told Murphy about her assault, but his first instinct was suspicion rather than concern. Standing roughly 4 feet away, he observed no marks, bruises, cuts, redness or swelling to Miss Heard's face, or areas on her scalp where hair appeared to have been torn out. Just like Samantha McMillan, Kevin Murphy did not find Heard to be wearing any makeup. Besides surface-level appearances, another reason Murphy may have been quick to develop feelings of suspicion was that according to him, in all his time around the couple, the only party he had ever witnessed being abusive was Amber Heard. In the form of shouting, though Depp had apparently told him privately about being on the receiving end of physical abuse as well. Another witness to Heard's lack of injuries was a nurse by the name of Erin Borum. Borum is particularly interesting, as she wrote notes detailing her observations at the time. Borum was also not only a nurse, but a friend of Heard's by Heard's own account. She visited Heard at her home on the 17th to deliver medications. Her notes do state that she observed Heard to be actively bleeding from her lower lip. Depp and his team claim this would have been the result of a bad habit Heard had of actively chewing and picking at her chronically chapped lips. We can't say whether the cause of the cut the blood was emanating from was that or an act of violence, but it should be noted that any cut from December 15th would not be actively bleeding 48 hours later unless the scab was reopened somehow. What's much more important though is what Nurse Borum did not observe. Her notes from the visit state that after Heard told her Depp had torn out clumps of her hair and bruised her scalp in the process, she inspected Heard's scalp but could not see any such hematomas. The only other observations she made about Heard's appearance were that she looked dishevelled with unbrushed hair and appeared weepy with sad and slouched posture. When this was put to Heard on the stand, not only did she remain firm, the description she gave of her injuries was if anything more severe than what she described in her witness statement. She asserted that at the time of her encounter with Nurse Borum, she had, quote, 2 black eyes, a broken nose and a broken lip, bruised ribs, bruises all over her body. It's in this incident where this video contends a rather striking amount of bias begins to become apparent in Justice Nicole's ruling. He essentially just writes off Samantha McMillan as being wrong about Heard not being in makeup at the time she observed no bruises, and accepts Heard's claim that she was wearing makeup on the basis that her friend Raquel Pennington attested that she saw bruises on Heard and that Heard's makeup artist, Melanie Iglesias, made a declaration affirming that she did in fact apply makeup to Heard to cover the injuries. He seems to ignore Kevin Murphy's witness statement entirely and without explanation, though elsewhere in his judgment, he does cite Murphy expressing strong loyalty to Depp and messages between the two. Taking loyalties into account when weighing up dueling witness statements is no doubt valid, but he never seems to apply the same scrutiny to Pennington and Iglesias, whose personal and professional interests are very much aligned with standing in good favour with Amber Heard. Which brings us to Nurse Erin Borum. Borum did not have any particular allegiance to Depp, and in fact seemed to have more of a personal friendship with Heard. In Justice Nicole's ruling, he reasons that because Borum was just dropping off medications on the way to see another patient, it would not have been remarkable for her to miss all of Heard's injuries sans the broken lip, as she did not have time to perform a, quote, clinical examination. Just to make sure there's no confusion on this matter, what Justice Nicole is saying here is that it is, in his opinion, more likely than not that a trained nurse did not notice patches of bare scalp, a busted nose, and 2 black eyes on account of being in a bit of a hurry. There are some pieces of evidence that support Heard, however. Most notably, a covert recording she made of an argument she and Depp were having sometime after the incident, wherein Depp seems to verbally acknowledge the headbutt.
You can throw a punch, screaming is okay. You can headbutt somebody screaming, but don't scream.
I headbutted you on the
Couldn't believe you did that.
forehead. That doesn't break a nose.
The explanation Depp gave for this on the stand was essentially that he misspoke. His version of events is that as Heard was punching and hitting him from behind, he swirled around to grab her arms and restrain them. In the course of doing so, both of their foreheads clashed. It's his contention that that's what's being referred to in the recording. So when Heard says,
You can headbutt somebody screaming, but don't scream,
he adopts her language.
I headbutted you on the forehead. That doesn't break a nose.
What he's apparently meaning to convey is that while he inadvertently clashed foreheads with her, the impact that took place was not severe enough to cause the injuries she was claiming. For what it's worth, Depp admits scrawling the message on the counter. Whether or not you think the man is a wife-beater, it seems well established at this point that writing messages on household items is an outlet for some kind of release for Johnny Depp. We'll make quick work of Incident 4, as the main reason it's a chosen incident is that understanding it is key to being able to follow what's happening in Incident 5. In terms of the violence after Amber Heard's birthday party, it's largely he said, she said, with no other witnesses to the allegedly violent episode itself, and some conflicting witness accounts regarding the state of Depp when he arrived at the party. Who you believe in relation to the claims of violence in this incident will likely hedge on who you most believe overall. And so next we have the matter of the poo in the bed. This is important to explain in a little more detail, primarily because again, it will help you follow the next incident, and secondarily, whether or not you believe Heard was responsible for the feces, either personally or by way of colluding with a third party, may well have some bearing on whether you accept she could be unhinged enough to do other things Depp and his team allege, completely fabricating an abuse story that spans the course of several years, for instance. Heard's contention is that one of her Yorkshire Terriers was responsible for the feces. As was mentioned in part 1, the discovery was made by one of Depp's housekeepers, Hilda Vargas. Vargas wrote a sworn statement attesting that she never believed the feces could have come from the dogs, due to their size compared to the size of the excrement, coupled with the fact that she had cleaned up their mess several times previously and had never observed anything like what she saw in the bed that morning. Shortly after her discovery, Vargas informed estate manager Kevin Murphy of the situation over the phone and sent him pictures of the excrement, which he then passed on to one of Johnny Depp's security guards, Sean Bett, who in turn passed them on to Johnny Depp. According to Kevin Murphy's sworn witness statement and testimony, a few weeks later, on May 12, he spoke to Heard over the phone, and she was very angry that he had sent the pictures to Depp, as the episode was further exacerbating their marital problems. According to Murphy, Heard tacitly admitted responsibility in this call, referring to it as, quote, just a harmless prank. Heard, as you would imagine, completely denies ever making such a remark. In his ruling, Justice Nicole found the poo was more likely than not the doing of one of the Yorkshire Terriers, as Heard contended. Some of his reasoning was, in this video's opinion, odd. He found the notion of Heard leaving the feces as a means of revenge inherently unlikely, as Depp had left the penthouse the night prior to its discovery for another property he owned in Switzerland, meaning he may not have even found an opportunity to discover it before his cleaning staff. This makes some sense. Nicole then goes further, stating, quote, as long as he was away, it was Heard who was likely to suffer from the feces on the bed, not him. This makes very little sense, as Heard and her friends were bound for the Coachella Music Festival, and we don't have any reason to believe she would be anticipating a return to the penthouse before Depp. He makes no reference whatsoever to Murphy's account of the harmless prank remark when explaining his finding, presumably again deeming Murphy to be unreliable due to his expressed loyalty to Depp. Incident 5 is a particularly tricky one to unpack. There are conflicting witnesses with respective loyalties to Depp and Heard, and an awful lot of details are in dispute. So it's probably easiest to begin with what's agreed upon. Depp and Heard were in their penthouse on the evening of May 21st, for the purpose of discussing their relationship and the prospect of its dissolution. An argument did take place concerning the feces found on the bed. Heard was adamant that she was not responsible, and at one point she called Kevin Murphy, put him on speaker, and asked him to retract his account of her referring to it as a harmless prank. Depp claims that when Murphy refused, Heard began screaming down the phone at him, calling him a liar. Regardless of how aggressively she made her feelings known, both parties certainly agree Heard expressed that she did not regard his account as truthful. The next person on the phone was Heard's friend Io Tillett-Wright, who was told he was suspected by Depp as having been responsible for the actual act of defecation. Wright did laugh or otherwise treat the subject with a derisive attitude, which Heard claims caused Depp to fly into a rage. Again, regardless of how aggressively he made his feelings known, both parties agree that Depp expressed his displeasure at Wright's attitude toward the matter. It's at this point, where there is very little about what transpired and how, that is not in contention. Depp of course denies taking Heard's phone on which Wright was on speaker and hurling it at her face. He does however agree that Heard began screaming out for Wright to call 911, all as part of a hoax to stage an incident of domestic abuse. Not long after this, Wright sent a text to Raquel Pennington that read, JD attacking Amber, she told me to call 911, I am doing it. Not long after this, Pennington is in the penthouse. Depp denies there was a physical scuffle of any kind with her. He also again denies laying hands on Heard, but does not dispute that she began screaming out for him to stop hitting her. This, he submits, was for the purpose of furthering the hoax, and her cries did prompt Depp's security personnel, Sean Bett and Jerry Judge, to run inside. When they arrived, however, Depp claims Heard was still 20 feet away from him, sitting on a couch. and when she noticed them, she quickly switched to the past tense, saying Depp would never hit her again. At this point, Jury Judge urged Depp to exit the residence, which he did. All of the accusations that he was smashing up various things and swigging from a wine bottle are categorically denied by Depp. As mentioned, a problem with this one is there are multiple witnesses, but they contradict each other. You can likely guess how things break. Heard's friends affirm her account, Depp's employees affirm his. To keep things simple, we'll just call that a wash and focus on testimony that comes from seemingly disinterested parties, as well as things that are actually documented. The first thing to look at is photographic evidence. These are two images taken by Raquel Pennington on the night of the incident. They demonstrate how variance in lighting can make a rather noticeable difference with appearances, as the images are taken moments apart, yet the alleged injury looks somewhat larger and more defined on the left. Depp and his team don't contend the injury is photoshopped, but rather that it is faked with something like makeup. One thing we'll note is that if it is faked, whoever applied it was quite clever, because they mimicked the sort of markings you might see from a blunt object striking the area around the eye very accurately. You can see some redness, with a linear edge, around Heard's right temple and under the eye, in keeping with the side of a linear object coming into contact with this area. If Heard's temple was the point of impact, you might expect blood to accumulate under the skin around the eye, resulting in a red colour like we see here. The only part of the markings that look potentially atypical is the redness on Heard's eyelid. Most of the time it would take a few hours for this area to show bruising as a result of blunt force impact to the temple and lower eye socket area. But we can't say the eyelid categorically would not redden within an hour of such a strike, so it's not of paramount importance. Little to no swelling is visible, though it is supposed to be a fresh bruise, and these sorts of things can vary considerably. Can this sort of mark be created by household makeup products? Absolutely. There is unfortunately no way to differentiate coloration from such a product, and coloration from actual blunt force trauma with only a photograph to go on. So ultimately, you just have to decide how plausible you think it is that Heard or Pennington would have understood the general pattern of eye injuries adequately enough to pull off this convincing of a job. The next thing to do is to compare the images presented by Heard to what witnesses other than her friends, or anyone with a clear loyalty to Depp, attest to seeing that night. The most notable of such witnesses are police who showed up on the scene after Depp's departure. Officers Melissa Sains and Tyler Haddon responded to Tillit Wright's call, and were in the building at a time which would have been very close to when Heard was allegedly struck in the eye with the phone. Both officers were trained in handling and investigating domestic violence calls. They both got a close look at Heard, and both testified to detecting no injuries or swelling of any kind on Heard's face. Nor did they detect any signs of vandalism in Depp's penthouse or the building as a whole, such as wine stains in the hallway, as seen in photos taken by Raquel Pennington. They did not investigate further after Heard told them she did not want to make a complaint against Depp, which it should be noted is not uncommon for domestic violence victims. In his ruling, Justice Nicole found that the officers' accounts were flawed due to factors such as that they had not taken contemporaneous notes on the call, and in their subsequent depositions about 2 months later, demonstrated notably imprecise memories. Specifically, Officer Sains estimated they were in the building for 30 to 60 minutes, whereas CTV footage showed the duration of their visit to be closer to a mere 15 minutes. He also noted that while Officer Sains did not detect anything she deemed to be an injury, she did observe reddening in Heard's cheek, which she attributed to crying. Maybe she was right, but the fact that she observed something on Miss Heard's face that corresponds with what we see in the photos taken by Raquel Pennington casts some ambiguity on the matter, Nicole found. There's another piece of evidence from the night of Incident 5 that unfortunately did not come out until 2021. Well after the conclusion of the London trial. Body cam footage from 2 other officers that arrived on scene at 10:28 PM that same evening, an hour and 8 minutes after the first 2 officers left. Heard and her friends had not been expecting them. The reason for their visit is that 2 separate 911 calls, one from IO Tillit Wright and one from an anonymous woman in the building who may or may not have been Raquel Pennington, prompted 2 separate call-outs. The fact that these officers wore body cams gives us the invaluable opportunity to see some of what they saw rather than just rely on statements. Unfortunately, the footage won't shed further light on Heard's injuries, but it is very illuminating when it comes to the claims of property damage. The body cam is angling downward, which would normally be very irritating, but for the time the officers are walking the hallway, we really couldn't have asked for anything more. Heard and her friends testified to Depp spilling red wine in the hallway and offered photographs documenting the stains he left behind. As the officers walk from the elevator to the penthouse where most of the damage is alleged to have occurred, there is barely an inch of the carpet that the body cam fails to capture in good light. Not a trace of a wine stain is to be seen. Before Raquel Pennington's husband Josh Drew opens the door, the body-cammed officer even turns around to the one unscanned corner, as if he was specifically tasked to offer as much clarity on this matter as possible for our benefit.
You guys had somebody come out here earlier? Yes, we did. Okay. I can't remember the names offhand. The card is Diane, maybe? Yeah, we got another call. I don't know if it's related to the same call from earlier or if somebody called again. I'll go get the business card from the cops. Yeah, I don't know. Just because we got another call and we came again, we still got to make sure. Give me 1 second. Back up. Please, back up. We'll just come in and just check. We need to make sure.
It's upon the officers entering the penthouse that we begin to wish the body cam was facing a bit straighter, but it certainly doesn't give us nothing. Now, before we begin pointing out the state of various corners of the penthouse, just so you don't mistake us for being disingenuous, no one has alleged that Johnny Depp smashed everything in sight into pieces. There isn't one identifiable object we can point to and say, aha, they said this specific thing was broken. But Heard and Co. did allege a serious bust-up, with Depp throwing multiple items around and violently smashing all kinds of objects off tabletops. So the question is just how congruent the state of the penthouse seems with their story in the main. There's no sign of anything smashed on the floor, though granted it's possible they would have attended to something that required urgent attention, like broken glass by this point. Here you get a pretty clear view of the top of a kitchen island. No signs of disarray. A large vase filled with flowers is completely intact. Raquel Pennington did specifically name flowers as an item that Depp knocked off a kitchen island. This table to the side is tidy and adorned with multiple ornaments and other miscellaneous objects that appear to be in their proper place. It was specifically alleged by Heard that Depp threw candelabras. Here is one undisturbed pair. Here's another island that you never get a full shot of in one frame, but it has glass bottles and various other objects sitting neatly atop it.
It must have been like a double call.
Okay. Who's Amber? You? Okay. And Johnny? Is definitely not here. He's not here? Okay.
That's probably like 2 hours.
Okay. Yeah. Alright.
Unfortunately, the officers won't go any deeper into the apartment from here, but we challenge you to spot any area that is visible and could be called anything less than tidy. Both officers have stated they noted no damage of any kind anywhere in the penthouse or building. We won't say it would have been impossible for the group to do a thorough cleanup of the damage described before the body cam footage was recorded. But to do that in just a little over an hour would have required them to focus just about all of their attention on the task almost straight away. For what it's worth, in Heard's witness statement, she claims that they had, quote, cleaned up by the time the second officers arrived. Josh Drew states that they cleaned up broken glass on the kitchen floor so the dogs wouldn't get hurt, but left other things like books that were strewn about as they were. Pennington's statement mentions nothing about any cleanup. This is a video captured by Amber Heard on her cell phone at an unknown date. She has placed it in February of 2016, while Depp has stated he believes it to have been filmed around 2013. Heard supporters maintain it validates much of her characterizations of Depp's violent mood swings during their marriage, while Depp supporters maintain that if you look at it critically, it actually undercuts aspects of the monster narrative. The surface-level significance of the video speaks for itself, so we'll play it through once uninterrupted before going back and breaking down the various observations that both camps have made about it.
Motherfucker! Motherfucker!
What happened? What happened? Nothing happened this morning, you know that?
Were you in here?
No.
So then nothing happened to you this morning.
Yeah, you're right. I just woke up and you were so sweet and nice. We were not even fighting this morning. All I did was say sorry.
Did something happen to you this morning? I don't think so.
No, that's the thing.
You want to see crazy? I'll give you fucking crazy. You're crazy. Oh, you're crazy. Oh, you're crazy.
Have you drunk this whole thing this morning?
Oh, you got this going. You got this going?
I just started it.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Really? Sneak that shit on me, motherfucker.
I didn't. You were smashing shit.
Oh, bye.
Heard is trying to obscure her phone with the coffee cup and will soon switch to trying to do so with her body. Depp supporters believe this is a demonstration of her duplicity. Depp and Heard actually had a sort of recording policy when it came to their relationship and arguments. Sometimes they would be having a fight, often while inebriated, and then the following day when they were talking it through with cooler heads, one would disagree with the other about exactly how bad they were behaving during the argument from the previous day. To attempt to counteract this issue, they apparently agreed it would be acceptable for them to record what was going on in real time, so they could demonstrate precisely how each other were acting at a future date. But they had to announce that they were recording. Depp and his team contend Heard attempting to conceal her phone is a telling sign her intentions in filming this moment have nothing to do with improving the health of their union. Rather, she's found Depp in a weak moment and is cynically exploiting it by collecting footage that might benefit her down the line. Depp's team have come to refer to this sort of behaviour as building an insurance policy, collecting material that in the event of a divorce would provide her leverage to ensure a handsome payout.
Ah! Motherfucker! Motherfucker!
What happened?
We don't know the answer to this question, unfortunately. Neither Depp or Heard have been able to recall the precise context which caused Depp to be so enraged here, which in and of itself does make one wonder exactly how frequently Depp would be angry enough to scream and pound various household items with his hands and feet.
What happened? Nothing happened this morning, you know that?
Were you in here?
No.
So then nothing happened to you this morning.
Yeah, you're right. I just woke up and you were so sweet and nice. We were not even fighting this morning. All I did was say sorry.
Did something happen to you this morning? I don't think so.
One point Depp supporters make about this footage is that while Depp does take his anger out physically on doors and the like, he never makes a move to strike Heard. While this is true, his behaviour can still be fairly characterised as intimidating, and actions such as throwing and smashing a glass object
To you this morning? I don't think so.
are not just a further escalation, but also match the sort of behaviour described in parts of incidents 2, 3 and 5, though granted the glass object was not aimed at Heard.
No, that's the thing.
You want to see crazy? I'll give you fucking crazy. That's crazy. Oh, you're crazy.
Remember Depp's claim he only stocked the Australia house with booze for Heard and visitors? Technically it's unfair to insinuate just because someone was very much not sober at one time, they likely weren't at another. But as a rule of thumb, you don't need to stock a property with multiple bottles of spirits and wine during a temporary stay for the sort of purpose Depp claims. Depp is the only one documented doing things like filling a pint glass to the brim with red wine, the sort of drinking habit we'd expect to see in someone who would need the kind of supply arranged in Australia.
Are you crazy?
Have you drunk this whole thing this morning?
Oh, you got this going? You got this going?
I just started it.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Really?
From the sound and look of things, we just witnessed Depp throw a phone with considerable force. Again, not at Heard, but it's still not a great look.
Sneak that shit on me,
No,
motherfucker.
I didn't. You were smashing shit.
Oh, bye.
Moments after we hear Heard chuckle, we also get a glimpse of what appears to be a slight smirk on her face. The point that's made about this is that as unacceptable as Depp's behaviour may be, nothing about Heard's demeanour during this 2-minute video seems to suggest that she is afraid of Depp, which is especially curious if Heard is right about this being filmed in February of 2016. That would place it after the assaults on the plane in Australia and the severe beating that left her with 2 black eyes and a nearly broken nose. Staying on the subject of recordings that paint Johnny Depp as being less than a picture of stable mental health, another of Heard's recordings that was put forward over the course of the trial was what we'll call the Cut Me tape. Not much is known about the surrounding context of this, other than it's apparently from July 2016. Depp and Heard are in a hotel room, and Depp is holding a knife.
Cut me wherever you want. Cut me.
This is really pretty.
Thanks. You want to cut me somewhere?
Do I want to cut you?
Yeah. You want an arm? You want a chest? What do you want? What do you want the scar? What do you want? Cut me.
Just don't cut your skin. Please do not cut your skin. Please don't.
Cut me.
Why would I do that?
It's easy.
Don't. Please do not do that. Please do not do that.
Cut me.
Please don't. Please don't cut yourself. You don't need to cut yourself.
I need to do what I want.
I know it hurts. I feel the same.
Cut me. I want your mark.
You have it.
No, you don't.
You have it.
They're gone. No, thank you. No, thank you. There's sperm on the pillows. Cut me. If you don't, I will. Elliot Spitzer won't answer this because he's conservative.
Don't.
Cut.
Please don't. Don't cut yourself. Please don't cut yourself.
Cut.
Please don't cut yourself. Please, I know it
You
hurts.
do it.
I would never cut you.
Cut me.
I would never do that to you. Please
Cut
don't.
me. Come on. Yeah, you hate me. Come on. Cut me.
To me first.
Not a problem. What do you want?
Not on my arms.
Not on your arms. Not on your arms. be cut? Do you? Just gonna go to court?
The knife is really dull.
I have to use a sharp part.
Don't do that.
Okay.
Don't
you tell me.
Please don't do that. Put the knife down. Just put the knife down. Don't do that. Do not do that, Johnny. Please, you're gonna
look at you.
You're gonna hurt yourself. Please
I
stop.
want to look at you.
I know you're in pain, but stop. Please
There's
don't.
a way for the pain to go away.
No, it's not. It's not that. It doesn't make you.
If the July 2016 date is correct, it's worth noting this puts the recording in between the restraining order and the settlement. So why the two are in a hotel room together is anyone's guess. Because of the lack of surrounding context, there's not a lot we can read into the clip beyond what's apparent on a surface level. That is, Depp is clearly unwell and open to having injury inflicted upon him, as well as inflicting injury on Heard, albeit only with her permission it seems. In honesty, the main reason the cut me tape is even being included is so this video can't be accused of whitewashing Depp's mental state. We mentioned that Depp and Heard had a recording policy. This included what we would call DIY marriage counselling sessions. The full 2-hour audio of one of these, apparently recorded sometime in 2015, has become publicly available and includes a variety of intriguing moments. One thing that's particularly interesting is comments the couple make that relate to the dynamics of violence in their relationship. Clips from this recording made quite a splash when they came out, and Heard and her supporters objected that they were edited to make her look bad. In light of that, we should disclose that the following audio we're presenting is of course just one segment, and it has been trimmed down, but the edits are purely for presentational purposes and do not change the meaning of what can be heard on the full 2-hour tape, which is linked in the description.
Every fucking fight, there's a new thing that you've convinced yourself is a lie.
I said to you, Amber, tell Travis what you just did. Did you just fucking... Did you punch me in the fucking jaw? Did you fucking kick... Did you? Did you? And you wouldn't say a fucking reason.
I didn't punch you, by the way. I'm sorry that I didn't hit you across the face in a proper slap, but I was hitting you. It was not punching you. Babe, you're not punched.
Don't tell me what it feels like to be punched.
You know, you've been in a lot of fights, been around a long time. I know. Yeah.
No, when you fucking have a closed fist.
You get punched. You got hit. I'm sorry I hit you like this, but I did not punch you. I did not fucking deck you. I fucking was hitting you.
You can't
I don't know
deck
what the motion of my actual hand was, but you're fine. I did not hurt you. I did not punch you. I was hitting you. You're a fucking baby.
Because you start
You
physical
are
fights?
such a baby. Grow the fuck up.
Because you start
Johnny.
physical fights?
I did start a physical fight.
Yeah, you did, so I had to get the fuck out of there.
Yes, you did. So you did the right thing, the big thing. You know what? You are admirable.
So, now that we've been through 5 incidents, various witness accounts, text messages, audio and video records, what are we to make of this turbulent relationship as a whole? Beyond that it was clearly an abject train wreck, we don't really have a concise answer to that question, especially in light of the fact that this story is punishingly not over yet. At the time of this video's release, Depp and Heard are again in court, this time in Fairfax, Virginia, with Depp suing Heard directly for defamation over an op-ed she wrote for the Washington Post that heavily insinuated he abused her over the course of their marriage. Who's to say what will come out during those proceedings? Maybe details tantalizing enough to result in Johnny and Amber Part 2 popping up in your subscription feed later down the line. Probably not though, because frankly at this point we've had a guts full of both of them.